And here we go!
Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey, Blackhawk fan. You might think you are exempt from this kind of roasting, but when did Taser age like the Nazi that chose poorly? Your 10-year stretch from 1998 to 2008 was absolutely brutal. And before that, in 1971, it looked like you were going to put the Canadians away easily, and then you gave up a Jonathan Bernier-level mid-ice goal to Jacques Lemaire. And then you blew the game and lost the cup, which started a 39-year drought. Of course, your success comes with baggage, as Patty Kane's reputation as a partier got him some nice allegations and caused him to lose some more hair. Geez, Patty, would you just give up and shave that mess? It's thinner than a French runway model.
Rocky Wirtz is the son of Bill Wirtz, who was maybe one of the biggest assholes ever to own an NHL franchise, as he was known as a cheapskate and miser, earning the nickname Dollar Bill. You want to know where the family money came from? Real estate and booze. Wirtz Beverage was founded in 1946, and the Hawks have been in the family since 1954. Rocky Wirtz, however, seems to have his shit together, as he ousted Dave Talon, hired Joe Quenneville, and repaired his late father's relationship with Bobby Hull. Good job on not being an asshole like your dad, who once fired a coach by slipping a note under his door.
Also known as the Madhouse, the 300 level of the stadium offers 2 bars that have panoramic views. There are statues of Bobby Hull and the late Stan Mikita and some guy named Michael Jordan, whoever that is.
All day since the rumors had started in the summer has come. A black eye has been given to the sport of hockey itself. The NHL tried to keep it quiet and hush-hush the speculation for as long as they could, but the darkness of the 2010 Chicago Blackhawks has been brought to the light. It has been confirmed that they enabled a sexual predator who took advantage of his position of power to assault players against their will. And the Blackhawks did nothing about it for a decade. It was even worse since this was a team that went on to win a Stanley Cup. This championship's now tainted. The entire dynasty is tainted. Every time this run is mentioned from now on, it won't be for ending a long-standing streak of playoff failure and Dollar Bill's cheap reign of terror. It will be for how the entire fucking organization covered up repeated acts of sexual assault against several players. Everyone around the team knew, and high-ranking officials ignored it during their playoff run for reasons of maintaining locker room chemistry. I don't know, I'd say forcing players into sexual acts is doing a good job of fucking that up. Even worse is that Brad Aldrich, the piece of shit who did this, wasn't only allowed to leave the Blackhawks with dignity after the season. Chicago gave him letters of recommendation for future employers. Like all predators, he acted again and again. He allegedly pulled the same shit at Miami of Ohio and/or Notre Dame, and it culminated in him using his position of power as a high school coach to sexually assault a 16-year-old boy. This damage could have been avoided, but the Blackhawks now have a irreparable scandal on their hands. I'm not surprised at all that it took this long for these actions to be revealed. Being abused against your will, especially as a man, is seen as a sign of weakness. It's shameful and humiliating. People see it as if you deserve to be emasculated. You're inferior. You'll be shunned from the team due to said weakness as a man. This goes against the stereotype of being a professional athlete. You're supposed to be an alpha dog, a cock-of-the-walk dynamo whose shit doesn't stink and everyone bows at your feet. No matter what league or age bracket, you are considered to be above people for your talents. Kyle Beach wasn't drafted with the 11th overall pick without cause. He had talent and upside, but look at his career trajectory before and after the events that occurred. I used to think that he just never developed. It happens to so many players, but with this new revelation? How much of his career stalling out was due to the trauma of those assaults? He's admitted to abusing drugs and alcohol to try and cope with the pain. Despite his situation, Beach was deemed as a locker room cancer and an inadequate team player for years. Some of that was due to his days in junior, but a good bit happened when he was in the minors. He never played in the NHL and shuffled around hockey to where he's now in an obscure European league trying to etch out a living. This isn't about Beach or the Blackhawks. It's about the sport of hockey as a whole. There is a massive culture problem surrounding it. And the only way to move forward and heal from these atrocities is to admit there is a goddamn problem. I can already tell the NHL is only paying lip service to Beach. You know how I can see that? It's because Coach Q was able to be behind the bench the day after the allegations were not only revealed to be true, but he had insider knowledge of the whole damn situation. I don't care that he resigned with a shred of dignity the day after the game. Why wasn't he forced to take a leave of absence off the bat? Fuck the locker room chemistry. I don't know how you're able to go into a locker room and gain the respect of the players after this shit. They aren't drones, for fuck's sake. They're human beings with actual feelings, emotions, and motivations for doing what they do. Far too often, hockey forces players to lose their humanity and sacrifice themselves and their bodies for the benefit of the team. Potentially years of quality life taken away because players play with severely crippling injuries. Ever see the injury reports that come out after a team's eliminated from the playoffs? Dudes are playing on broken legs, broken feet, severe injuries that would take them out for weeks at minimum. I understand why players go along with it. Jobs and roles in the NHL are scarce. If they choose not to play to heal up their obvious injury, someone else will probably take their place. Especially if you're, say, a fourth-line grinder with no leverage in your situation. You're on the first bus back to the minors, potentially to never see the NHL again. The coaches don't give a shit. To them, you're replaceable. There are plenty of wide-eyed recruits eager to go right into the meat grinder. They need to re-identify how they announce injuries. Have you ever noticed how they classify them in hockey? It's either as an upper body injury or a lower body injury. Unless it's to where they literally cannot walk or hold a stick. Then they will show mercy and actually identify the injury. What the hell is an upper body injury? Is it a scratch or is the player without a limb? If the coach tells you to go out and play, you're playing. They don't give a shit about anything else besides winning. The coaches know they're getting fired if they breathe improperly, so they'll do anything to keep their jobs. You may have broken bones, just pop some pills. Robin Lehner threw out some truth bombs on Twitter, and I'm highly inclined to believe them. The frequent usage of painkillers and drug cocktails to mask pain, steroids and hard drugs like cocaine used to alleviate pain and stress. It probably happens a hell of a lot more in hockey than we'd like to think. Shit like this happens in the NFL all the damn time. In a physical sport like hockey, doesn't matter if Jack Eichel wants a different surgery. Doesn't matter if the surgery the Sabres want will still leave him in pain. It's not your body, it's the team's. If you object, it's like 1930s Hollywood. They'll force you out of town for being a cancer and make sure you never play in North America again. They'll call up all their buddies, reporters, and insiders and leak some info about you being a locker room nuisance. You'll never get another chance at the NHL again. It's all about gentlemen's agreements. Don't poach our RFAs so we can depress player salaries. Don't do anything to give the players any sense of free will. Scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Look at a guy like Bob Murray of the Ducks. He's long had a reputation of being a piece of shit, and has probably threatened this same outcome with many players in his tenure. There's a reason why it's taken so long for him to not only be snuffed out, but seek help for a long-standing alcohol addiction. It's because hockey enabled it. This isn't about Kyle Beach or Bob Murray or anyone else. This is about the true issue of hockey. It's something I've been bitching about for years. The good old boys club. Incestuous buddy hires insulating an organization from the cold realities of the sport. Endless contempt that stagnates and rots from the inside out. If you're a high-ranking executive, there's a good chance you're either a former player or knew a former player. Why go outside the hive mind? Those strangers won't make for good drinking buddies. You can't smoke a cigar with them. You'd have to treat it like a business instead of a social club. What the Blackhawks scandal reveals to me? A damning testament to the failure of the boys club. A felony was committed in their house. Yet nothing was done so the boys club wouldn't have to be challenged. The boys club wouldn't dare compromise the sanctity of locker room chemistry and team cohesion. Sexual assault isn't about hockey. That's annoying noise unfit for a team. The same shit spreads to the talking heads on television for hockey. How long do we have to hear incompetent hacks and cavemen ramble on about this sort of thing? You're having fun on the ice? Nope, goes against the boys club, you're a bunch of jerks. Hockey has a culture problem, and it's permeated all aspects of the sport. In junior leagues and younger, it's even worse. There isn't even a toothless union to protect the players. They're just goddamn cannon fodder. If you're lucky or talented, you get to move on. If not, they'll just discard you and use you as firewood. How many former players either have some form of brain trauma or have been unable to adapt to life due to permanent injury? You don't have to look hard for examples. And it's not just goons or enforcers suffering. Look at Paul Correa's struggle since retiring. Go and hear testimony from guys like Nick Boynton, Daniel Carcillo, and Patrick O'Sullivan. Joe Murphy has been fucking homeless due to his failure to adapt after hockey. Countless drug addictions and suicides due to the grind of the game and its aftermath. And those are just the ones that are public or well known. Many former players suffer in silence. No paltry settlement or lawsuit can alleviate the symptoms and pain they go through. It's a cold reality that the boys club chooses to ignore. The only thing I'll give the Blackhawks credit for is being transparent with the findings and bringing it to the public eye. It's far too late for anything to be done, but at least we know some truth to the situation. We need to restate that the NHL is only doing things because they got caught with their pants down and failed to cut out the tumor before it spread throughout the body. And instead of address it head on, they're scurrying to get it out of the media cycle like a rat exposed to light. Only a $2 million fine for the Blackhawks? For covering up sexual assault for a decade? When the Devils were fined $3 million and lost draft picks for circumventing the cap? Fuck off. Just fuck off. Sorry, Badger Bob, but I can't agree with you today. This is a dark time for hockey. One of the bleakest in the sport's history. The only way to fix it is to rip the wound open so it can properly heal, but I expect the NHL to do little of substance about it. Just the standard motions in current year PR moves. Token gestures, buzzwords, hollow pandering, and virtue signaling, pretending to champion causes that I know they don't give a flying fuck about. I'm not about statements. I'm about actions. Words mean nothing when you just say them to get likes on social media. But the actions of the league and those involved show me is that they only care about their image. Not the victims of assault. Not Kyle Beach. Not the second Blackhawk or the 16-year-old victim of Aldrich. Themselves. And that's the most infuriating thing about this. I'm watching a slow-motion train wreck that they could easily avoid but won't. I hope this gets fixed, but something tells me we'll be seeing more of this shit in the future. See you then. The Windy City came a-calling not too long after the pink slip was fouled in Philly. No surprises there, he only had the second best record in those 4 years besides Glenn Sather. The Blackhawks are going to be a little more of a challenge. They're not as young, they have a core in between eras, but they at least have Denis Savard. That's a start, right? Well, the season didn't go so well. It's the worst season in Keenan's young NHL coaching career, but since you'd have to shit yourselves repeatedly not to make it into the playoffs, Chicago was able to play on. All this mediocre team did was rattle off 2 upset series against hated divisional foes. Things look great, but then Keenan runs into his kryptonite. Alberta hockey teams. The Flames loot and raise everything. This is the cost of overachieving. Delaying the inevitable. They're a hell of a lot better this year. They even got this Jeremy Roenick kid who's pretty good too. It's nearly a carbon copy of last year. Pull off series wins against hated divisional rivals, including those inbreds in St. Louis in a Game 7. Then there is the whole Oilers deal. Yeah, they're still around and somehow still kicking your ass. Perhaps someday life as we know it will reward Chicago. Do you like President's trophies? The Blackhawks got one. And Mike Keenan is now the GM of the team. Things are looking bright. 106 points and strong favorites to reach the cup. A huge void is filled as Edmonton is on the decline, you know? It could be your time. You just have to get past these scrubs in Minnesota as a first test. You didn't? You lost in the first round to a 68-point team? You lost 3 straight games to close the series? What the hell is wrong with you people? Let's forget last year ever happened, shall we? The Blackhawks have finally made the Stanley Cup Finals after that which shall not be named. Fueled by revenge, they utterly dominate their foes, even those fuckers in Edmonton. Yeah, fuck them and their dead dynasty. This is your time, boys. The Penguins unfortunately had a deflector shield and used your own potency against them. I hope you like brooms, where you get nothing but a good old-fashioned sweep in front of your fans. Be comforted, Chicago. The real winner here is Dollar Bill. So Keenan just made it to another cup final. He's getting a ton of success at this level, and his coaching notoriety is one of the most prestigious in the league. Here is where Iron Mike yearns for more. He desires control, and a lot of it. Even as he demands additional duties as GM, a great power struggle ensues. The Blackhawks want to keep his hunger in check and force him out of coaching duties for a hot new prospect. Slowly but surely, things get quite untenable and Keenan loses said power struggle. Bye-bye, Mike. We'll see you back in this spot in another 3 years.
Tim Higgins was all over this one as the Hawks got crushed by Original 6 rival Detroit back in '87. Higgins chipped in 3 goals and the Hawks were held to 19 shots. Interestingly enough, no Red Wing notched more than 3 points even though they scored 12 goals. Balance, people. You heard of crotchless panties? Well, Tony Esposito constructed whatever the opposite of that is, sewing some kind of mesh contraption between his legs to help clog up his 5-hole. Those Puritans love him. Tommy Hawk, a mascot that looks surprised that he is allowed to even do his job. The avian-themed character really displays the kind of fight you would like to see in a mascot. Literally. It looks like Tommy has had some sprawl training, maybe taken an intro MMA class or 2. Nice job, Birdman.
The Chicago Blackhawks had missed the NHL playoffs in 6 of the last 7 seasons. That's when owner Rocky Wirtz hired general manager Dale Talon to rebuild the roster of what ESPN called the worst franchise in sports. Just 2 years later, Chicago would boast a pair of generational superstars ready to headline a modern dynasty. The Blackhawks took center Jonathan Toews 3rd overall in the 2006 draft, and a year later won the lottery, literally and figuratively, selecting winger Patrick Kane first overall. The franchise now had two future megastars at the same time they were already developing a defensive core of Duncan Keith, Brent Seabrook, and Nicholas Hjalmarsson, with prospects like winger Brian Bickle in development. After trading for the Flyers' Patrick Sharp, a title-caliber foundation was in place. Off the ice, Wirtz lured Chicago Cubs president John McDonough across town, not just to oversee a rebuild of this original six franchise, but, like McDonough had created for the Cubs, a transformation of the Blackhawks into a cultural brand. Finally, Joel Quenneville was promoted to head coach in 2008 to stabilize a bench that had seen 8 head coaches since 1998. By the time the baby Blackhawks lost to Detroit in the 2009 Western Conference Finals, Forbes magazine already hailed the franchise as the greatest sports business turnaround ever. Believing a championship was close, Talon signed veteran winger Marian Hossa to a huge 12-year, $62 million contract. Hossa was meant to be a missing piece to an almost perfect picture, and a year later, the Blackhawks won their first Stanley Cup since 1961, defeating the Philadelphia Flyers in 6 games. During a hangover season in 2011, Chicago drafted winger Brandon Saad, and longtime backup goalie Corey Crawford became the permanent starter and a fan favorite. Chicago would lose another first-round playoff series in 2012 before the NHL lockout, but the Hawks bounced back in a shortened 2013 campaign, winning the President's Trophy and beating Boston in a legendary 6-game Stanley Cup. After they were knocked off by eventual Cup champs Los Angeles in 2014, the Hawks came right back to beat Tampa Bay for a 3rd Stanley Cup in 2015. 3 Cups in 5 years, led by 2 young superstars and a dynamic core of supporting players. Chicago had already completed a dynasty, and there was no reason this group couldn't keep going at a championship level. But even superstars can't do it alone. Along the way to becoming hockey's best franchise of the decade, Chicago's promising youth had evolved into veteran superstars, with contract demands to match. But let's back up a second, because Talon, the GM who built this dynasty, was actually gone before the Hawks' first Cup win. Before the 2009-10 season, the NHLPA filed a grievance against Chicago, claiming Talon had waited too long to offer qualifying offers to restricted free agents, which ultimately resulted in Chicago paying more to retain a few of their players. All things considered, it was a minor gaffe at the time, but enough for McDonough to demote Talon and promote assistant GM Stan Bowman, son of NHL coaching legend Scotty Bowman. Talon quickly resigned. Even as a GM, he was well-liked by players, but Bowman was hockey royalty and understood to be McDonough's guy. During the excitement of the dynasty run, the new GM pulled off what Chicago fans demanded, locking up both Kane and Taves to identical 8-year extensions in 2014 at an average annual value of $10.5 million each. Both players had offers for more money on other teams, but the logic of all involved was that Chicago and its superstar duo would be stronger together. And both deals featured no trade clauses, further cementing the pair's presence for the decade to come. Now that 2 players made up roughly a third of the Hawks' payroll in 2015 and beyond, one of the very first casualties of this investment was Saad, who was traded to Columbus when Chicago couldn't fit his contract demands. If Talon was the architect of these dynasty Hawks, Bowman became the custodian. And because Chicago was so good and so young and so popular seemingly all at once, these Blackhawks' real rival wasn't the hated Red Wings or the Crosby-Malkin Penguins or the Kings' neutral zone defense. It was a salary cap. Remember that lockout in 2012 and 2013? To resume play, the league and the players' union settled on a $60 million salary cap subject to an annual adjustment in either direction based on league revenue. So, when something as random as Canadian crude oil prices drove down the value of the loonie in 2014, it lessened the revenue of the NHL's 7 Canadian franchises, lowering the cap growth for the following season. For teams carrying big contracts, the difference of a few $1 million could reshape an entire offseason, and Chicago was shouldering some serious debt. But even with a tighter purse, the Blackhawks still needed to keep their defense in place. Bowman chose to pair Keith and Seabrook for the long run, signing Seabrook to a huge deal alongside a 13-year extension that Keith signed back in 2009. The Blackhawks expected another cup run with their now expensive young core. That meant Bowman's margin for error would be non-existent, and Kane and Taves would have to be perpetually awesome. To create some breathing room under the cap, Chicago traded Sharp, a fan favorite, to division rival Dallas. But at least for the 2015-16 regular season, the price tags matched the hockey. Kane especially played like a $10.5 million superstar, scoring a league-best 106 points amidst a sexual assault investigation in his hometown of Buffalo. But another potential dream season disappeared in the playoffs. Chicago was minus Keith for Game 1 after he was suspended for 6 games after a high stick. St. Louis jumped to a 3-1 series lead, and winger Andrew Shaw was suspended for 1 game after using a homophobic slur against a referee in Game 4. The superstars went silent. Kane was held to just 1 goal, and Taves went scoreless. Still, Chicago managed to scrape back, tying the series and forcing a Game 7. But a freak shot on goal by Seabrook that bounced off both posts was initially called a game-tying goal. After video review, it was called off, and St. Louis knocked out the defending champions in the first round. From a distance, this was a brutally close loss against a division rival, but with Kane and Taves as non-factors, the series was also a new blueprint on how to beat these post-dynasty Hawks. If you take the 2 big names out, Chicago wasn't so scary anymore. With a handful of players chewing up payroll from then on out, Bowman would be forced to hit on almost every other minor contract and ancillary trade to maintain Chicago's quality depth. He couldn't afford to miss on any deal that ate up cap room, such as Brian Bickle. After Bickle exploded for 9 goals in the 2013 playoffs, Bowman signed him to a 4-year, $16 million deal. But Bickle's production plummeted, and his $4 million annual cap hit became an albatross for Bowman, who finally unloaded him in a trade with Carolina in 2016 in exchange for draft picks. Luckily, a gift from Russia had already landed on the ice. Calder-winning rookie forward Artemi Panarin helped mask the effect of an increasingly apparent cap crunch, just as Taves and Kane peaked as legit superstars. Chicago's headliners carried the load in the 2016 season, even with Taves battling through injuries. The Hawks finished with 109 points and the first seed in the Western Conference, led by the top-heavy line of Kane, Panarin, and Artem Anisimov. As long as you didn't look too far down the roster, these Blackhawks were still a superstar team in their prime, capable of another cup. Then, everything disappeared in 4 games. The Blackhawks were swept in the first round by a comparatively no-name Nashville Predators team that swallowed Taves and Kane whole. Nashville goaltender Pekka Rinne allowed only 3 goals in the entire series with a .976 save percentage. It was the first 8-over-1 sweep in NHL playoff history and the first postseason sweep of the Blackhawks since 1993. Just like the previous postseason, Chicago fell down early, but there was no chance of a comeback. Nashville outscored the Hawks 6-0 in games 1 and 2 at the United Center. Taves, still just 28, was shockingly mortal against a faster, more aggressive Predators team. His only goal of the series came down 3 in Game 4, while Chicago's expensive defense looked alarmingly slow, leaving Crawford on his own. This wasn't the close, gritty loss like the 7-game series against the Blues a year prior. This was a total blowout, a sweep at the hands of a franchise considered to be Chicago's little brother. Bowman called the sweep unacceptable and deemed the season a complete disappointment. When asked if complacency had set in around the franchise after 3 Stanley Cups, Bowman raged, "If that's the case, then we're going to get rid of those people, because the only reason we come here is to win the cup." A wild overcorrection began. To kickstart a youth movement on defense, the GM pulled a series of shockers, first trading Hjalmarsson, arguably the team's healthiest and most reliable defenseman, to the Coyotes for Connor Murphy and Laurent Dauphin. Then, in a stunner, he sent Panarin to Columbus to return fan-favorite Saad in addition to prospects and draft picks. Panarin, a player Kane himself credited with making his own game better, was traded for a less effective veteran version of himself with the same cap hit, but a few extra years of control. Oh, and both players were favorites of Quenneville, creating friction between the coach and GM. Panarin represented the best and worst parts of Chicago's front office. They had an eye for young talent and were smart shoppers on the international market, but couldn't hold on to rising stars once they reached market value. Bowman dealt a player who would become a top 10 forward in the league, knowing that he'd never be able to fit an inevitable long-term deal for Panarin under their bloated cap. Despite the fact he'd arrived at just the right time to help compensate for an expensive, aging group, Panarin was too good. And when Saad was traded away for prospects again just a few years later, the Hawks basically had nothing to show for Panarin, a superstar who could have been the bridge to another title run. Bowman had shaken up the roster to shake off their sweep, and now the last thing Chicago could afford would be an unexpected injury to any of their remaining core players, which, yeah, it's hockey, so that's bound to happen, but no one saw the end of Marian Hossa's career coming. In June of 2017, the Hawks announced that Hossa would miss an entire season due to an aggressive form of eczema. The otherwise healthy veteran, who was still a reliable goal scorer, had developed a rare, severe skin allergy to his own equipment. Hossa literally couldn't put on his own pads without aggravating his condition, and while Chicago was able to use his status as a long-term injured reserve to move his big contract off the books, they couldn't replace his offense. A year later, the remainder of Hossa's deal was traded to the Coyotes, and after league doctors determined the side effects of the medication treating his eczema were too severe to play effectively, Hossa stopped playing and announced that he'd retire at the end of his contract. Down Hossa and Panarin and only getting older, the Hawks scrambled, re-signing an aging Sharp after a 2-year stint in Dallas, only to have him retire at season's end, as well as a slew of cheap veterans like Tommy Wingels, Lance Boma, and Cody Franson, all in an effort to build immediate depth. But the patchwork slapped across the 2017-18 roster busted open when Crawford missed the second half of the season with an upper body injury believed to be a concussion. Crawford's game had arguably improved since the team's Stanley Cup run, to the point where he could have been considered the team's actual MVP. And when they lost his .929 save percentage after just 28 games, an aging, thin defense was badly exposed. Kane and Taves still played like stars, combining for 128 points, but Chicago was a team that, according to Saad, just lacked confidence. They finished with 76 points, 19 shy of the playoffs, missing the postseason for the first time in 10 years. The signs had been obvious, but now it was a reality. The ride was over. All of a sudden, the hockey world could see Chicago for what they actually were, victims of their own success. The kismet of draft luck and a near-perfect hot streak of young signings was long gone. Now, almost a decade later, Bowman, the guy after the guy, just looked desperate, constantly rolling the dice on small, short contracts and trades to create space for those cheap deals. After the cap-mandated youth movement had failed to keep playoff momentum, Bowman immediately used the space freed up by Hossa's retirement and traded for another group of veterans, Chris Kunitz, Brandon Manning, and goalie Cam Ward, potentially to permanently replace a still-injured Crawford. Things certainly looked bleak in the front office, but as team president, McDonough gave a public vote of confidence to both Bowman and Quenneville, who had just coached through his first losing season in 21 years. McDonough promised that both would return the following season. That lasted 34 days into the 2018-19 regular season. After a 5-game losing streak in November, Chicago fired Quenneville and replaced him with Jeremy Colleton from Chicago's AHL affiliate. Despite a pedigree coaching career, 3 Stanley Cups, and a top-heavy roster and cap hell for multiple seasons, McDonough assumed that Bowman could still figure out a way to rejigger a quality supporting cast underneath its big names, but a change on the bench would spark a roster suffering from age and that perpetual patchworking. It did not. Instead of a spark, Colleton just ignited friction with many of the team's cup-winning veterans, especially Seabrook when he tried to overhaul the defensive scheme mid-season, and Chicago finished 6 points out of the playoffs. Yes, Patrick Kane and Jonathan Taves were still superstars, but finally, and inevitably, that's where it ended for the Blackhawks. After another flurry of trades, Chicago entered the COVID-19 suspension of play in March of 2020 at a mediocre 32-30-8, having suffered a string of injuries to Seabrook, Saad, and others. Looking for his own spark, owner Rocky Wirtz opted not to fire Bowman, saving the GM yet again, and instead sacked McDonough. Out went the man who took a franchise from blacked out of their own TV market to an 855-game sellout streak and 3 championships. In October of 2020, the team released a public statement that touted their commitment to, quote, developing young players and rebuilding our roster. Soon after, every supporting player from the Blackhawks Stanley Cup run was unloaded. Bowman didn't renew the contract of Crawford, now 35 and 3rd in career wins all time in franchise history. After Chicago missed the playoffs again following a shortened season, Duncan Keith requested a trade to finish his career closer to home and was dealt to Edmonton, while Brent Seabrook was sent to Tampa, where he would soon retire. Taves, still a Blackhawk, opted to sit out the 2021 season due to an immune system condition. And despite a still growing list of blunders and the inarguable fact that he could never recreate the core Talon had built to support Kane and Taves, Bowman kept dealing, still firing away while his pair of superstars had their window. The man who critics say usurped his position on the eve of those 3 championships had managed to outlast the boss he'd politicked to get the job and the coach he'd stymied with bad trades. Having too many superstars is certainly a good problem, but it's still a problem. No franchise in the NHL salary cap era shined as bright and as suddenly as the Blackhawks. But you can't win with just a pair of aces, and after failing to maintain or replace the production of their supporting players during the Cup run, Chicago was an old, expensive husk of its championship self, no matter the names left on the marquee. Just a year after that public commitment to developing those young players, Chicago sent highly touted defensive prospect Adam Bockwist, 2 first-round picks, and 1 second to Columbus for veteran Seth Jones, coming off of a terrible season for the Blue Jackets. Then, Bowman immediately signed Jones to a $76 million extension with a huge annual cap hit. It was just the latest in a series of questionable moves, but however Jones figured into Bowman's latest retooling or rebuilding scheme never mattered. For all of the Blackhawks' desperation to maintain a championship facade, something far worse had been present in the franchise since the beginning of their dynasty. On May 13, 2021, former Blackhawks player Kyle Beach filed suit against the team, alleging that the Blackhawks worked to cover up, quote, a prolonged sexual assault of Beach by former assistant coach Brad Aldrich in 2010. Beach's suit prompted an investigation that found, in May of 2010, a meeting of Blackhawks leadership that included Bowman, Quenneville, and McDonough took place to acknowledge Beach's assault allegations against Aldrich, but team leadership concluded that no action would take place until after Chicago's playoff run and eventual Stanley Cup championship concluded. According to the investigation, Bowman recalled that, after learning of the incident, Quenneville shook his head and said it was hard for the team to get to where it was and they could not deal with this issue now. On October 26, 2021, Bowman was one of multiple Blackhawks executives who resigned from the team in response to the internal investigation. Quenneville, then the head coach of the Florida Panthers, also stepped down. NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman stated that anyone involved in the Blackhawks cover-up would have to meet officially with him before pursuing any future job in the NHL. The very end of the Blackhawks' darling run of championships and business accolades started at the beginning, because for 3 weeks between May and June of 2010, Aldrich was allowed by the leadership of Chicago's hockey renaissance to continue working with the team, interacting directly with his alleged victims, and even riding in the championship parade. According to the report, Aldrich also made an unwanted sexual advance to an intern during that period. Chicago eventually allowed him to resign with severance after the 2010 postseason. The Blackhawks did not report his behavior to authorities, and Aldrich would go on to coach at a Michigan high school where he would plead guilty to sexual contact with a student. His name was etched on the Stanley Cup as part of the Blackhawks' first championship in 49 years.